It is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. There are few people who have had a greater impact on the national conversation about democracy, campaign finance, and political reform than Lawrence Lessig. At a time when trust in our institutions is under strain, and many Americans are questioning whether our political system is working as it should, or really even at all, Professor Lessig has spent decades asking one of the most important questions in public life: how do we build a democracy that truly serves the people? Professor Lessig is the Roy L. Furman Professor of Law and Leadership at the Harvard Law School and one of the country's leading constitutional scholars. He is also the founder of Equal Citizens, a nonprofit dedicated to fighting corruption and strengthening American democracy. Earlier in his career, he helped pioneer the Creative Commons movement, fundamentally changing how knowledge and creativity are shared around the world. He has written numerous influential books on democracy, constitutional law, technology, and institutional reform, and has become one of the nation's leading voices on the relationship between money, power, and democratic accountability. Tonight, he joins us to discuss corruption, not simply in the criminal sense, but in the systematic ways in which incentives, influence, and money can distort democratic institutions. It is a conversation that affects us all, regardless of political affiliation, and one that could not be more timely. So please join me in giving a warm Crested Butte welcome to Professor Lawrence Lessig.
So I'm so grateful for the chance to be here to talk to you about something that has been at the center of my life for the last 20 years. Exactly 20 years ago, a friend, a boy named Aaron Swartz, came to visit me in Berlin. Aaron had been a boy genius in the internet community. He had, at the age of 12, crafted the protocols that would launch RSS, which permitted syndication of content across the web. He had helped launch the book archive at archive.org. He had provided the technical infrastructure for the Creative Commons, and he had provided a key part to what would become Reddit. And that gave him enormous freedom so that he could do what he wanted to do most, which was to make the world a safer place for the spread of knowledge and information. Aaron came to visit me because I was on sabbatical in Berlin, and he wanted to talk to me about my work, because the thing Aaron did, the thing he loved to do, was to tell people what they should do. And so at that point in my career, I had been working on internet policy and copyright policy. As Devin mentioned, I had helped with him to found the Creative Commons. And I was working on what would be my last book on copyright, preparing a TED Talk, my first TED Talk, about the questions of copyright. And Aaron listened to me, eagerly describing the work, eager for his approval. And he looked at me and he said, "How are you ever going to make any progress on the issues you're talking about, copyright, internet policy, so long as we have this deep corruption in our political system?" And I said to Aaron, Aaron, it's not my field. And he said, "You mean as an academic?" And I say, "Yeah, as an academic, it's not my field. I do internet policy and copyright policy." And he said, "Okay, but what about as a citizen? Is it your field as a citizen?" And I knew at that point he had trapped me, because I didn't have an excuse. I had tenure. I could work on anything I wanted to work on, and I knew he was right. I knew that there was no reason to imagine progress in copyright or internet policy or even other issues not so esoteric, climate change or income equality or healthcare. There was no reason to expect any sensible progress on any of those issues so long as we lived within deeply corrupted political system. And so that night, I promised I would give it up. I promised I would take up the work to build understanding and a movement that might help us address this deep and fundamental corruption. And for the next 6 years, I worked on the project. He would sometimes work on the project. But then in January of 2013, we lost Aaron to suicide. 2 years before, he had been arrested downloading an academic archive, which apparently he wanted to make available to the developing world. The U.S. attorney was eager because she had found a cyber criminal. She promised in the press that she was going to send him to jail for 35 years. He spent 2 years fighting for his freedom. We thought he would win. He didn't. Now, suicide, I know many of you know this, has a blast radius. It affects people who are close in profound ways, especially those who believe, no doubt wrongly, but believe that they could have done something, they could have helped. And for reasons I won't go into, I was one of those people who was convinced, but for my failing, he wouldn't have made the choice he made. And so in penance, I committed to this fight until we win. I didn't think it would take a total of 20 years. But I'm here continuing that fight. And I will ask you at the end to join in that fight, not because you knew Aaron, maybe some did, but because a love similar to the love I had for my friend should inspire all of us in this fight. Now, the truth is, the fight has become more complicated. When I started, it was basically one issue I thought I was fighting. But over time, I've recognized there's many layers to this problem of corruption. I'm going to talk about 5. And I'm going to start right in the middle at the layer that Aaron started me on. This is the layer about how we fund campaigns in America and what that means. We take it for granted that campaigns in America will be privately funded, which produces a Congress which an artist represented like this, which is a fair representation because Congress is filled with members who spend anywhere between 30% and 70% of their time dialing for dollars. For any younger people in the audience, this is a telephone. Asking people to help them to fund their campaigns. B.F. Skinner gave us this image of the Skinner box where any stupid animal could learn the buttons it needed to push to get the sustenance it needed to survive. This is the life of a member of Congress as they learn which buttons they need to push to get the sustenance they need to survive for their campaign to survive or for their party to prevail. This life has an effect on them. They develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness of how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shape-shifters as they constantly adjust their views in light of what they know will help them to raise money. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, "always lean to the green." And then she went on to clarify, he was not an environmentalist. Now, this is a corruption. We could call it dependent corruption. It's a corruption because it's a dependency that is different from the dependence that our framers intended our Congress to have. Madison in Federalist 52 promised us a branch of the federal government which ought to be dependent on the people alone. And by the people, he clarified in Federalist 57, he meant, quote, "not the rich more than the poor." That ideal, that principle, that design has been corrupted because of the way we fund campaigns in America. That's the middle layer, what I'll call the dependent corruption layer. Now, 3 years after I began this work, a new layer was added. And this was an explosion of a certain kind of PAC, what came to be called a super PAC. And a super PAC is an independent political action committee, a committee that will raise money and spend it independently of a campaign. But because of a decision of the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, it can raise contributions in unlimited size. So it can raise $1 billion, as one super PAC did, from one individual. Whatever size they can take. And since 2010, then, we've seen an explosion in super PAC spending. So total outside spending in 2010 was about $0.3 billion. In the last election, it was about $5 billion. And the percentage coming from billionaires, about $31 million in 2010, $2.6 billion in 2024. That's a 63-fold increase. Super PAC spending, which is different from the amount they raised, was $2.6 billion in 2024. It's a 41 times increase. And dark money, which was not a thing in 2010, is now about $1.9 billion of that total amount that was spent. This is our oligarchy that has evolved because of these super PACs that have been created by the lower federal courts and permitted to flourish by the United States Supreme Court. This, too, is a corruption. It's similar from the dependence corruption, but it is a corruption that gives power to a tiny fraction of Americans. I'll call that the oligarchic corruption. And then there's another corruption, literally unimaginable 16 years ago. I'm going to let my friend John Ossoff introduce this corruption.
Just listen to this. Last September, the president of Kazakhstan calls Donald Trump and says he wants to grant tungsten mining rights to an American company. And the very next month, Eric and Don Jr. get a stake in the American company pursuing the mining deal. 6 days later, 6 days after Prince Eric and Prince Don get their stake, Kazakhstan announces this company will get, quote, the largest known undeveloped tungsten resource in the world. A few more weeks go by. And then the US government, run by their father, sets aside $1.6 billion of your tax dollars to fund and finance their mining project in Kazakhstan.
So here's the mine. What he's saying has been verified by a wide range of sources. It's just one example. 2024, just before the election, the Trump family launched World Liberty, which was a crypto exchange. They also launched a meme coin, which gathered extraordinary amount of money from Trump supporters, which then evaporated as the value of the meme coin collapsed. But the trick is, every transaction, selling or buying that coin, puts money back in the Trump family's coffers. And this exchange received billions of dollars from Saudis and Chinese investors eager to make the administration happy. A company run by essentially the Trump families and the Trump allies, accounting for an increase in his net worth since becoming president of $2.3 billion. Or here's another example. Just last month, it was revealed that in the filings that the president has to make under federal law to reveal any trading that he might be doing as president, in the first 3 months of 2026, the president placed more than 3,600 trades. Day trader in chief. And trading stocks directly related to the work he's doing as president. Buying stock, then making an announcement that would benefit the company, shilling the product of companies whose stock he's purchased. And when asked about it, he either doesn't know how to explain it or doesn't want to explain it. But I think we have to acknowledge there's a simple word to describe this which has not been predicated of any president in American history. It is kleptocratic. Kleptocratic. Third world, banana republic kleptocracy. This is a corruption, and it's increasingly the new normal. Here's the Speaker of the House.
Speaker, you were very critical of President Biden and his family's foreign business dealings. You supported an impeachment inquiry as a result of it. Are you equally concerned about President Trump's family's business dealings, especially given the fact that he is in a region now where his family has billions of dollars of investments in Doha, in Saudi Arabia, and the fact that he has a crypto business now where he's auctioned off access to the White House for the highest bidder in his meme coin?
Look, there are authorities that police executive branch ethics rules. I'm not an expert in that. My expertise is here in the House, okay? I will say that the reason many people refer to the Bidens as the Biden crime family is because they were doing all this stuff behind curtains, but in the back rooms. They were trying to conceal it, and they repeatedly lied about it, and they set up shell companies, and the family was all engaged in getting all on the dole. Whatever the President Trump is doing is out in the open. They're not trying to conceal anything.
Somehow it's out in the open and therefore it's okay. It's better. I mean, it makes it worse. It makes it worse. I don't know the real corruption of real presidents for the past 200 years of America. I know nobody. Never have we had a president who has felt less constrained by the norms that go with that great office. And how is this possible? I was in a wonderful event last night and the question was asked, how is it even feasible? I think Devin asked this question, right? Because, if you're a worker at the Department of State and you go out with a friend, that friend can't buy you a cup of coffee. So how is this possible with the president? And the answer is that the Supreme Court has become fixed on a completely made-up theory about executive power that says that the president can fire anybody in the executive branch. And just yesterday, they released this decision in Trump versus Slaughter, reversing earlier precedent that set some agencies aside, protected some agencies from presidential control. Now, the court has at least said the Fed can't be controlled by the president, but everybody else, which means the Justice Department has been stripped of the normal lawyers who would be policing these kinds of activities and raising questions of ethics and challenging decisions of the government that played out this kleptocracy. All of that is gone, and constitutionally can't be replaced. Now, I don't think every president from now on is going to be the same, so I'm not actually worried that we're going to see the same, but what I am worried about is that it attracts this kind of person who knows the most powerful government in the world is a plaything for personal gain and personal wealth. We'll call that the kleptocratic layer. And then underneath all these are two other layers. So the framers of our Constitution were, kind of engineer wannabes. They had this complicated, Claude did this for me, I didn't really do this, but complicated scheme for like checks and balances to make sure that we would never face the threats of a runaway government or a tyrant or an authoritarian because those tendencies would be limited. And it was the mechanism here that would be the important dynamic to protect us. That was their constitutional design. And the first check on a tyrant or an authoritarian president was to be Congress. And again, their scheme, this kind of mechanism, imagined that Congress would step up and check a president acting beyond his power. But partisanship has now changed the very character of this constitutional design. Because the question is no longer the executive versus Congress. The question is the Republicans versus the Democrats. And that partisanship is like oil or syrup poured into the framers' design, breaking it, making it no longer a design that can check the corruptions of any branch. Or the second line of the check was to be us, the people, through elections, which through our history have always happened every 2 years. Even in the middle of the Civil War, Lincoln had an election. And so the people, if they don't like their government, have the power, in theory, to rise up. That's what the framers expected. But gerrymandering has now so dramatically muted the voice of the people that you could have an election where literally 70% of America opposes the current government, but because of gerrymandering, no more than 51% of Congress will reflect that attitude of the vast majority of Americans. This I want to call the constitutional layer of corruption. But underlying this layer is a final, maybe most difficult layer to address, what I'll call a cultural layer of corruption. And this really has two components, and the first bit I'm going to blame on AI. And I'm going to distinguish here between two kinds of AI, what I'll call new AI and old AI. And so new AI is, all the cool little models you play with, and, this may lead to something called artificial general intelligence, which some expect will be the end of humanity. And I kind of find arguments like this kind of compelling. So I'm a little bit of a torn soul because I love AI and I hate AI just because it will destroy humanity. But, I don't want to say anything negative about AI because I'm pretty sure our robot overlords will be reviewing these lectures at some point. And I don't want to be on the wrong side of the robot overlord. So I'm going to say the new AI is extraordinary. It's wonderful. There's nothing to worry about with the new AI. It's the old AI we need to think about. Today's threat is not the new AI. Today's threat is the old AI. And by old AI, I mean new media or social media, because it's old AI that runs social media. AI drives it. Old AI, stupid AI. Stuart Russell, in this really fantastic book, describes it like this. The algorithms of social media he's describing here, they aren't particularly intelligent, but they are in a position to affect the entire world because they directly influence billions of people. Typically, such algorithms are designed to maximize click-through, that is, the probability that the user clicks on presented items. The solution is simply to present items that the user likes to click on, right? Wrong. The solution is to change the user's preferences so that they become more predictable. Change the user's preferences. A more predictable user can be fed items that they're likely to click on, thereby generating more revenue. People with more extreme political views tend to be more predictable in which items they will click on. Possibly there's a category of articles that die-hard centrists are likely to click on, but it's not easy to imagine what that category consists of. Like any rational entity, the algorithm learns how to modify the state of its environment, in this case, the user's mind, in order to maximize its own reward. The machine is operating on the brains of everybody using the machine to turn them into more extreme versions of themselves. Because more extreme versions are more reliable customers. So they don't want to turn us into polarized Americans. That's not the mission of Facebook or Meta or whatever you want to call one of these companies today. It just turns out they need to do that to maximize the amount of money they will make. So this dynamic imposes what economists would call an externality on society. Externality is imposed upon us because it just turns out, too bad for us, that the best strategy, the most profitable strategy to drive engagement is the politics of hate. We engage more. The more extreme, the more polarizing, the more hate-filled content is. And that content thus renders us as a people incoherent, democratically incoherent. Now compare what this media does to the coherence of what Marcus Pryor called broadcast democracy, the kind of democracy most of us here remember, the democracy of Walter Cronkite media. Now that media was not unbiased, but it was coherent in the sense that these companies profited by rendering us coherent, by rendering us a people who understood what was going on and understood it in a consistent way for the vast majority of Americans. It was in their business model, and they made an extraordinary amount of money telling it, as Cronkite would say, as it is. But these companies profit by rendering us incoherent. So take a particularly tragic example. Whatever you think of January 6th, the thing to recognize about those people is that the vast majority of them believed something. They believed their election had been stolen. And you tell me what the appropriate thing to do is if you believe your election has been stolen. 70% of Republicans reported they believed the election had been stolen. And you think, well, this is just the uneducated Americans. But that's not true. 50% of educated, college-educated Republicans said they believed the election had been stolen. So 70% of Republicans turns out to be about 32% of Americans. But that's not the scary graph. This is the scary graph. That number doesn't change. Even though we've had endless investigations, endless studies to determine whether, in fact, that election was stolen, and none of these studies have revealed any evidence to suggest that there was any problems with this election that could have come close to flipping the results in 2020, still, the same number of people continue to say they believe that election was stolen. This is something new. Think about Richard Nixon, who came to office in 1969 and was liked by Republicans about as much as Donald Trump is, not hated by Democrats as much as Donald Trump is, and the independents are in the middle. And so in the period leading up to just before he had to resign, it's kind of stable support in the public. And then in the period leading up to his resignation, support for Nixon collapses. But the important thing about that graph is it's collapsing at the same rate for all three groups. All three groups are hearing the same story, and they are all learning that, in fact, their president is a crook. And they are reacting in the same way, because they are living within a media ecosystem that is just trying to tell them, as it is, however biased its view of how it was. This is not a world of bespoke realities. This is common reality, what we used to just call reality. But compare that to Donald Trump's first term. Never does his views change for any of these separate groups, because these separate groups are all living in their own bespoke realities. They're all being fed exactly what they want to hear, so that it confirms what their views are, regardless of what's happening around in the world. People on the left are being told this is the worst president in history. People on the right are being told this is a grand conspiracy against the best president in history. But the point is, it doesn't matter. These bespoke realities produce what we have to recognize is the new normal. And the consequence of this is that we, the people, become we, the polarized, ignorant, and angry, and democracy is thereby weakened. But here's the point to recognize, because it's easy to think this is in some sense necessary. This is the way it has to be. This is just a business model. It's not a product of a technology. It's a product of a business model using a technology. Just a business model. And with any business model, we should ask, are the benefits of that business model, and I imagine there are some, I don't know many, but I imagine there are some, worth the costs? So, if you told me the only way to deal with climate change was to weaken catastrophically democracy, I wouldn't agree with you, but I would understand what you were telling me. I would understand the terms of our debate. Or if you said the only way to address world hunger was to end democracy, again, I wouldn't agree with you, but I would understand what you are saying. It would make sense. But when you tell me we need to weaken, possibly catastrophically, American democracy so that a bunch of guys in Silicon Valley get richer, I don't even know what you're saying anymore. But that is what we are doing. We are allowing this system to continue to dominate American politics in a way that we know its consequences are to render us incoherent, solely because it's so important to continue to allow the stock market to reward these members of our society. That's the first bit of the cultural corruption. Here's the second bit, a little bit harder to connect, but I think it's just as important. So in the early 70s, this man, Milton Friedman, writes a very important piece in the New York Times magazine called "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits." And what Friedman is doing is he's attacking the corporate social responsibility movement, people who think that maybe corporations need to worry about things like the conditions of their workers or the communities they operate in or the environment or any number of other things that might not be directly related to profits. And Friedman's argument was that's just fuzzy thinking. There's just one purpose for a corporation. That purpose is to maximize profit, as he put it. In modern terms, it's maximize shareholder value. And that this singular purpose should guide executives, at least in for-profit corporations, and all other purposes should be put to the side. You might have taught your kids this story when you read the Lorax to them. This is the Onceler idea. And the point is, it becomes an irresistible way to engage in business, and not just in business, because it gives you a formula for figuring out what you should be doing. Just figure out how to maximize some one dimension. And then you have a way to see whether you're doing well or not. And this mentality spreads everywhere, not just in for-profit business, but not for-profit business, not just in business, but in education. In all sorts of fields, we increasingly have the idea that we know what we're supposed to maximize and we just fix our work to that end. But the thing to see is that this mentality renders us vulnerable to a kind of extortion. And we see this actually in the first year of this president's administration. Some have referred to him as the capo-in-chief, and that's the point to see. Think about the law firms who were threatened by the president illegally, because every one of those law firms who fought the president's claims have won, because the president had no legal basis for the threats he was putting against those law firms. Yet 9 of them settled and gave the president $1 billion in free legal services. Or think about CBS and ABC, threatened with lawsuits that should have forced their lawyers who filed those lawsuits to be disbarred, because there is no legal basis for either of those 2 lawsuits. Completely made up. Fabrications of the law, but threats. which instead of fighting, CBS and ABC settled and paid millions of dollars to the Trump interests in order to settle those claims. Or universities threatened with withholding of funding illegally and calculated the simplest way to address that illegality was simply to settle so that they could change their policies in a way the Trump administration demands, even though the demands had no legal basis. Each of these actors was behaving reasonably according to the standard, the measure of what they were in business for, whether it's to maximize their profits or to partner profits or to maximize corporate profits as corporate media or to maintain the size of an endowment. It all made sense. It was a reasonable thing to do. But the question was not right versus wrong for them. The question was only more versus less. This too is a kind of corruption, a corruption within a culture, rendering a culture vulnerable. These corruptions of or by a culture make it harder for the culture to sustain itself against the other layers of corruption that I've described. Call this the cultural corruption. Okay, these are corruptions. These are the 5 layers. And if I'm in this business for another 20 years, maybe I'll find another 5, I don't know. But I think this is a picture of where we are, which begs a new slide. Can they be cured? Is there hope? Because as Harvey Milk said, you got to give them hope. So is there hope? And Claude tells me there is. So let's just see. So with the kleptocratic corruption, let's just celebrate. This is it. There's not going to be a third term. There just is not. And people who talk about it, it's just crazy talk. There will not be a third term. And already the Democrats are beginning to put together a package of reforms to restore accountability in the executive. Just today, Kate Shaw, a brilliant law professor, wrote in the New York Times an article that began to map out some of these, including what I think we are going to need to do, excluding appellate jurisdiction to the Supreme Court over certain questions that the court has identified it will answer in a way that weakens the capacity of our democracy to address these corruptions. So that, I think, is hope for fighting the kleptocratic corruption. The oligarchic corruption, too, I am extremely optimistic we're going to solve. And the solution comes from the state of Maine. So in Maine, in 2024, there was a ballot question on the ballot, and the question was basically, do you want to ban super PACs? Surprise, surprise, 74.9% of Mainers said they wanted to ban super PACs. I had gathered signatures for this initiative on Election Day 2023. The first guy to come up to me said, I'm here to get signatures to put Donald Trump on the ballot. What are you here for? And I showed him my initiative, and he read it, and he said, hell yeah, and he signed it, and he said, I'm going to get everybody who signs my petition to come over and sign your initiative, and he did. The first signatures were all Trumpers. Because all of us are deeply disgusted with the system that has emerged. And so this passed, and of course, within 1 month, it was challenged by 2 super PACs in Maine, and the lower district court struck it down. And my group, Equal Citizens, retains the great Neil Katyal, Neil the tariff slayer Katyal, to take up the fight to defend this initiative. And Neil and I and everybody who takes time to pay enough attention to this issue begins to see that, in fact, we are going to reverse that case. And the United States Supreme Court is going to agree with us. Now, I know the reaction when I say something like that. Right. But here's the thing most people miss. When you look at this picture and you say, why has this happened? Most people say it's because of super PACs. And then when you say, why do we have super PACs? Most people will say it's because of a case called Citizens United. Here's my friend Bernie Sanders.
The billionaire class is not just satisfied to control the economic life of this country. They are moving aggressively to control the political life of this country. So while ordinary Americans get the right to vote, they have one vote, the billionaire class, as a result of this disastrous Citizens United Supreme Court decision, they have the right not just to cast one vote as a citizen, but to contribute hundreds of millions of dollars into super PACs who will elect their friends and defeat their political opponents. Now, if anyone in America thinks that is what American democracy is supposed to be about, well, I have a strong disagreement with you. Democracy is one person, one vote, not billionaires buying elections through their super PACs. And I would hope that here in Congress, that on the campaign trail, leaders of this country make it clear that we have got to overturn this disastrous Supreme Court decision on Citizens United, which allows billionaires to buy elections, and move to public funding of elections. And that is where we should be going if we believe in democracy.
Now, look, I share with Bernie a desire that the Supreme Court would back away from its whole jurisprudence trying to police the efforts of Congress or the people to make their elections more trustworthy and to increase the integrity of the political process. A series of decisions beginning with Buckley in 1976. I would very much hope that that happens. But if you think the only way we're going to solve this problem is to overturn Citizens United, then that is hopeless. Because this court is not going to reverse Citizens United. And this Congress is not going to propose an amendment to overturn Citizens United with 2/3 vote in each house. That's just not going to happen. But Citizens United did not give us super PACs. We have super PACs because of a lower federal court decision, Speech Now versus FEC, from the DC Circuit, the queen of the circuits, or king of the circuit, I guess. And once the king had spoken, the rest of the minions followed along, all agreeing with the DC Circuit that contributions to independent political action committees create no risk of corruption. Now, that's wrong. It's obviously wrong. I don't mean it's obvious once you see it, the reasoning of the decision. It took me a long time to get it. But it is wrong. It is clearly wrong. And it has not been appealed to the United States Supreme Court. The court has never had a chance to review this decision. And what Neil has become convinced of, as I am convinced, is that this decision, when appealed, will give the court the chance to do something that it will really want to do. Indeed, I think we're just giving the Supreme Court a gift. Because the Supreme Court will be able to write an opinion like this. It can say, many have criticized Citizens United. See, for example, the remarks of Senator Sanders, one of the worst Supreme Court's decisions ever. We disagree and affirm the reasoning of Citizens United. But Citizens United did not create super PACs. Speech Now did. And here's the point that's missed by all. Under the reasoning of Citizens United, the logic of Citizens United, that says that if there's a risk of quid pro quo corruption, you can regulate that speech, we hold Speech Now was incorrect. And when that happens, America reacts like this. And when America reacts like this, John Roberts smiles, realizing that the whole country finally finds a decision that they can rally behind from his court. And he gets to say, I'm not changing any of my views. I'm just affirming the principles in my cases that affirm that, in fact, super PACs can be limited. Now, it's going to take a year or two to get this done, but I'm pretty confident this oligarchic corruption will be slayed by the tariff slayer Neil Katyal. which leads to pendant corruption. And here, if we end super PACs, there's an explosion of ideas for finding ways to fund elections that are not funded by super rich people. Indeed, in 2021, we came within 2 votes of passing the Freedom to Vote Act in the Senate, 2 votes to exempt it from the filibuster. And this statute gave block grants to states to support projects to fund elections in citizen ways, whether matching funds the way New York City elects its mayor, see Mandami, or vouchers like Seattle uses to elect city officials in Seattle. Either way, this is a way to change the funding of elections from super rich people to all of us. And that's clearly possible, even with the rules the Supreme Court has set. The constitutional corruption, I'm not so sure about. Are we going to see Churchillian courage coming out of this body? I'm not yet sure we're going to see that. So I'm willing to concede maybe we won't get this. It's this part that I'm most interested in thinking about. Can we escape the corruption that engagement-based media is giving us? You know, how many of you saw this really fantastic series of films that began with A Quiet Place? So the story of this film is aliens invade, and they have a particular kind of disability. They can't see, but they can hear really well. And when they hear what they think is a carbon-based animal, they voraciously attack it so that they can plant its spores. And anyway, it's really gross and disgusting, but the point is they terrorize the whole nation. So, you know, the film is this really beautiful but terrifying dynamic of people learning how to live with the new reality of this alien presence that makes normal life no longer possible. So you could say, here we have alien intelligence, you could call it AI, that rendered normal life impossible. What we need to see is that so too is that true for us. An AI, digital AI, old AI, renders normal democracy, normal elective democracy, impossible by rendering us incoherent. So just as in The Quiet Place, they had to learn to live life differently, to address, to live with their AI, we need to find a way to do democracy differently. Do democracy in a protected way. Think about protected democracy, meaning structures that help make us sensible in our decisions about what government should be or do. Now, by the way, of course, the law already does that. Think about the deliberations of a jury. They are protected in this sense. A jury gets information that's been determined as relevant and filtered in a certain sense. They get both sides of an issue. They're then told they need to sit down and deliberate with each other and come up with a certain result. Reformers are trying to take that idea and spread it more broadly through a mechanism called citizen assemblies. Now, a citizen assembly is a random, so you randomly figure out who's going to be a member, representative, so you make sure that it's representative of all the demographics you think are important, informed, they're given information, which is the platform for their figuring out what to do, deliberated, meaning they then sit down and deliberate about what should be done. Protected democracy. And this has, of course, lived in our human experience since the ancient Greek did this in Athens, but all through Italy in the Renaissance period. For hundreds of years, this is the way government worked. And it's increasingly exploding across the world. So after the 2008 financial collapse in Iceland, they convened 900 random representative Icelanders to sit down and come up with a list of the issues that a new constitution should embed as the values of the Icelandic constitution. There was then a convention convened with about 50 people to draft that new constitution, which they did, and it then was ratified by 2/3 of voters in Iceland, and Parliament then ignored it. But the point is, the process produced this beautiful, reflective, responsive, representative document. Or Ireland's much more exciting. Ireland, after the crisis, began a process of regular citizen assemblies. The first they called Constitutional Convention. And they would meet, random representative group, relatively small. Originally it was 66 citizens and 33 members of parliament. Now it's 199 random citizens and one moderator for the process. And they address the issues they think Ireland must address that the parliament itself can't. So for example, they took up abortion regulation. And the Citizen Assembly proposed a deregulation of abortion, a sort of idea that the Irish Parliament could never have done. And through that deregulation of abortion, it was then ratified by the people in referendum. They proposed allowing gay marriage, which was then also ratified by a referendum. And now every year, or every couple years, depending on the cycle of the elections, they have regular citizen assemblies to address issues for the parliament. Or France has done a massive citizen assembly around climate. They've also now done one around end of life. Macron's last election, he got elected promising he would have a citizen assembly addressing these issues. And slowly in America, we begin to see similar things being developed, mainly at the local level, as they stand up processes to address local problems in ways their governments recognize they can't otherwise solve. But the point here to see is that this is not just a good idea. I think we have to see it's existential for democracy. Given the alien that has invaded, it is existential for democracy. Because here is, I think, the scariest graph I'm going to show you tonight. In 1997, Pew started asking what people thought about confidence in the wisdom of American people in making political decisions. And in 1997, 2/3 of us were confident in our political decisions, meaning the decisions of we, the people. But since 1997, those numbers have inverted. Because we all increasingly see we're surrounded by crazy people. And as we see we're surrounded by crazy people because that's what the media feeds us, we lose confidence in our own ability to make democracy work. And the only way to restore that confidence is to begin a practice that actually demonstrates we can make democracy work. And the magic in these assemblies is that it just turns out, even if you begin with people who are radically polarized, if it's structured right, and you sit down and you face people, and you try to work out problems together, you can. And they do, and they produce solutions that over 70% of the public will affirm as sensible solutions to problems they address. It's the business model of the assembly to solve problems. It is not the business model of Congress or the state legislature to solve problems. And if we could show us that this is possible by us, more and more of us would believe again in the idea of representative democracy by building that confidence in us. That's the hope in the cultural. That's why Claude thinks it's possible. But you're going to say, really? Come on. And okay, I'll use a little science fiction, and then I'll use one final plea to try to get you to the place that you believe it's possible. Here's the science fiction.
So it was only when your world was threatened with destruction that you became what you are now?
Yes.
Well, that's where we are. You say we're on the brink of destruction, and you're right. But it's only on the brink that people find the will to change. Only at the precipice do we evolve.
The precipice, which is where we are. We are on the precipice. And I think it should inspire us, but still, I find people are not inspired. I gave a talk at Dartmouth, and a woman raised her hand, and she said to me, "Professor, you've convinced me. It's hopeless. There's nothing we can do." And I thought, okay, that's a fail. And I thought then, for some reason, I haven't asked my shrink why, but I thought then about my then 6-year-old son. And I thought, what if a doctor said to me, "Your son has terminal brain cancer and there's nothing you can do"? Would I do nothing? Would I accept it? And of course, no. I would do everything because that's what love means. You don't care about the odds. You do whatever you can for those you love, and even we liberals love our country. We love our country, and we love the ideals that it speaks to. And so the question I leave you with tonight is, do you have that love? Not to ask whether these reforms are possible, but to say, I don't care whether they're possible. I know this is what we must do. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Question, Nancy?
Sure, quick. Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry.
Go ahead. Great.
Under what circumstances do you believe Speech Now and Citizens United would be revisited?
So if Neil succeeds in convincing the First Circuit Court of Appeals that Speech Now is wrong, the First Circuit's never considered this question before, so it's easy for them to consider it fresh. Then the Supreme Court will have to take the case because it will create a critical split in the jurisdiction. And I can give you a little bit of the reason why we're so excited about this argument. So what the DC Circuit had said was Citizens United held that expenditures that were independent of a campaign did not create a risk of corruption. Now you're thinking, oh, come on, when Elon Musk spends $20 million, don't tell me that's independent of the campaign. But the Supreme Court has an answer to that, which is, oh, okay, fine. If it's not really independent, then the expenditure is treated as a contribution, which means his $10 million expenditure is a $10 million contribution, which is a felony. So it's either independent or it's a crime. But either way, in theory, it's independent. The DC Circuit said, well, if the expenditure is independent and therefore can't create a risk of corruption, a contribution to a committee that makes the expenditure must also not create a risk of corruption. That was its conclusion. Then my favorite senator, Robert Menendez from New Jersey, 5 years afterwards, proved them wrong. So Robert Menendez was indicted. The indictment was he had promised government favors to a Florida businessman in exchange for the Florida businessman giving money to Menendez's super PAC. There it was, a quid pro quo corruption involving a super PAC. The very thing the DC Circuit said could not happen. Indeed, Menendez's lawyers had the chutzpah to file a motion to dismiss the indictment, saying the thing you've indicted us for, the DC Circuit says can't happen, so we must be innocent. Of course, they laughed like you did, but the point is it showed the mistake. And once that mistake was revealed, it began this frantic process to try to get the case up to the Supreme Court. Then, the second half to this, that's really exciting, is my second favorite senator, Josh Hawley from Missouri, who in October of 2023 introduced a bill to overturn Citizens United. What was his argument? He said, as any good originalist, originalism is the conservatives' theory for interpreting the Constitution, and 6 justices on the Supreme Court say they're originalists. He said, as any originalist knows, the original meaning of the First Amendment would never have limited Congress's ability to control how corporations spend their money. Huzzah, absolutely right. He would get 100% in my class. It's exactly right. But the Supreme Court in Buckley, the case that created this whole line of crazy jurisprudence in 1976, never considered the original meaning of the Constitution because originalism was not a thing in the 1970s, which is the argument the Supreme Court made when they overturned Roe, which also, they said, violated originalism. I don't agree with them, whatever, I'm not saying it's a good decision, but I do think that if they're going to take away a woman's right to choose on the basis of originalism, They ought to take away a billionaire's right to buy elections on the basis of originalism. If Roe, then Buckley. So the argument that Neil is making is both the core argument about embrace the logic of Citizens United, and under Citizens United we win, and oh, by the way, if you guys want to be consistent originalists, then here's a good chance for you to be a consistent originalist and show us that you are principled, not just political. Now, I clerked for Scalia early in his career, and I told the last time I saw him, I had lunch with him, last time I saw him before he died, I told him, he ruined me as a law professor, and he laughed, and he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, when I clerked for you, there are any number of times that there was the conservative thing to do and the originalist thing, and they weren't necessarily the same. And in every one of those times, you did the originalist thing, even though it wasn't the conservative thing. And so when I became a law professor, I predicted every time there was that conflict, you did the originalist thing, and I said, you let me down every single time. And he laughed, and he said, give me an example, and I talked about the campaign finance stuff. And by the end of the lunch, now he drank a little bit during lunch, so I don't know if this is really true, but the point is by the end of the lunch, he said, I think you're right. I don't think I can, consistent with my originalism, continue to restrict this to the Buckley standard. And then he died. I mean, not at lunch, but he died shortly afterwards. So my view is there are Scalia wannabes, in the best sense of that word, on the court. Amy Coney Barrett and Justice Gorsuch are two justices who are keen to demonstrate. Not always, but I think that they are open to hearing the argument. So we only need 5. We have 3. We need 2. I think we have the chief. We need one of them. That's 5. I'm betting 7. So that's a long answer. I won't give long answers anymore, but that's a long answer to your great question. Do you have a mic here? Or?
Oh, I have a question. In the balcony,
okay,
right
great.
up here.
Hi, great.
In one of the Supreme Court decisions announced today, the one in which permitted the sharing of political parties' funds with local elections, and I frankly don't quite understand the ramifications of that, but there apparently was language that stated that this would not promote corruption because what is corrupt is obvious. At least that's the way I heard it on NPR. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, so the question in this case was whether limits on political parties coordinating with candidates are consistent with the court's Buckley jurisprudence. And the court said those limits are not. Now, I wish they'd gone the other way. But one reason it was kind of compelling to them is that you can look at our political system and say one of the biggest problems in our political system is that the most powerful players are political action committees, and political parties are kind of irrelevant. And the thing about political action committees is they're typically single issue focused. There's the crypto super PACs that are focused on changing crypto policy into the most insane policy possible, which they succeeded in doing. Or the AI super PACs that are going to stand up to stop the ability of Congress to be able to regulate in the context of AI. They're single focused, and parties, at least in a happy picture of them, have a broad range of issues they're trying to advance, and so that might actually be a better political world if we had parties exercising more control than the super PACs. And the other thing they built into this opinion was they said that if you give money to a party and you earmark it for a certain candidate, then that's not allowed. That's treated as a contribution to the candidate. So you can't use this as a channel through which you can give huge contributions to a particular candidate, the way a super PAC effectively does. So I read this as not resolving our question, and so we will continue to push in the face of it. But it does signal the instability, I think, of this whole line of jurisprudence. Now, my view is blow it up. Buckley should be overturned. The people and Congress should be allowed to regulate the integrity of the political process. And the idea that the First Amendment should be what the Supreme Court decides in all of this complicated way over this 50 years of jurisprudence to police how we try to address the problem of corruption is crazy, just crazy. At the beginning of the conservative legal movement, they were excited to say to the Warren Court, sit the frick down, stop imposing your views on the political process. If you don't have clear statement in the Constitution justifying you overturning some law of Congress, then just sit the frick down. But they've forgotten this now because they're just making up all this stuff because they believe it is good, and they're imposing those views on the political process, and I think it has no legitimate democratic basis. So I wish they would blow the whole thing up. Some of them want to go even further, but we'll see. And the reason we're pushing the originalism is we want to hold their feet to the fire. You can't be mucking about on one half and blind on the other half, and we'll see if we can make them principled. Yeah. You don't have a mic. So does the person down here need a mic, or?
I've got one.
Great, you've got the mic.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Thanks a lot for coming this evening, Professor. This is terrific. Could you speak a little bit about foreign governments influencing our elections, and if more Americans knew how much influence there was from foreign governments, would that change anything for us?
Yeah, one of the strongest reasons why many conservatives are fundamentally opposed to the current system for funding campaigns is that it's become a huge foreign government loophole. Because when corporations are allowed to funnel money into super PACs, corporations under Citizens United were allowed to spend their money independently of campaigns, but there's not much of that spending now because they quickly discovered the high cost of free speech. Like Target supported an anti-gay candidate for governor, I think in Minnesota, and then found their stores being picketed all across the country, and they're like, this doesn't make any sense for us. So they stopped doing things publicly like that, but many corporations funnel dark money contributions in through super PACs. And when that's possible, then the question is, well, who is a corporation actually representing? You could have rules about what percentage of ownership makes it a foreign corporation versus not foreign, and there are those rules, but it's extremely easy to get around that. The state of Maine, before our initiative, the election before, by like 84%, passed an initiative to block foreign governments from involving themselves in ballot initiatives, because Canada was trying to control the ballot initiatives about Canadian power. That was struck down. It's not finished yet, but we'll see where that ends up. But I do think people don't have any clue that this is the simplest way in which this type of influence gets leveraged. And you increasingly see our politicians bending to keep the foreign people happy. The president has done this a bunch with, for example, Saudis putting a bunch of money in the crypto venture that I mentioned, and then magically they get access to these super powerful AI chips that, in the last administration they thought we should not be allowing spread around the world. So it's hard not to believe that the foreign governments have not found a simple way into controlling our government through this money. Yeah.
I have the power now. Yeah. So you presented, and I thought it was really interesting how you went through, I think there are 5 different levels of corruption there. And I don't imagine that any of them would take a sophisticated argument and give up their power.
Nope.
Right? Forget it. And so each one of them we have to acknowledge is individually irrational for what they're doing. How do we change that without revolution?
Yeah, I'm not sure we can. And so if there's a revolution, I just hope it's not bloody.
Not evolution, but revolution.
No, I get it. Yeah. I think, I'm not a revolutionary in the sense, I know a lot of people who are trying to build the revolution, God bless them. I'm not that, because I'm old and I have kids, so I don't want to imagine. But it's hard not to think that we're coming to a place where that's really imaginable, because the consequence of AI, which nobody has any effective way for dealing with right now. The consequence of AI is going to be catastrophic in the labor market, and at least in the short term. And though, the AI optimists say, well, there's enormous wealth that will be created by AI, and that could be wealth that makes it so all of us prosper, of course, that's not going to happen by the invisible hand. The only way that happens is if there's a government that can actually govern and make decisions to, use the sovereign wealth that's being produced by this technology and make it so all of us benefit, right? So I think that's feasible, conceivably, but it requires government, and again, that requires solving all of the problems that I've described. And so if you don't, we start seeing 30% unemployment, and not 30% unemployment by blue-collar workers. It's white-collar workers who, are not used to being vulnerable like this. Blue-collar workers are used to it, right? But white-collar workers, this is not what they signed up for. I don't know how that settles, right? So that's why I think it is so essential to fight this right now. And strategically, I think if we crack the money, the oligarch level, then that opens up the opportunity for the dependence corruption level. And I said I don't think the kleptocracy thing is something systematically we need to worry about. Those three are solvable, but it's going to be a fight. It's not like, an argument. I'm assuming you guys are not members of Congress, so I'm not trying to persuade you as a member of Congress, to persuade you as citizens, like what you need to demand of our government. I get it.
People on our end are losing health care and a variety of different things. Isn't that like a witch's brew for a revolution?
Yeah, if people understood it. So I did something before the last election I'd never done, which is I went to a high school reunion. And I grew up in kind of the Kentucky part of Pennsylvania. So I was a Republican when I was a kid. All of my friends were Republicans. But I couldn't imagine how they could support Trump. So I wanted to go back and find out. And I found one friend who was a hero. He's kind of football star and a wrestling star, farmer, teacher. And we started having a conversation. We had a podcast. We then decided to do a podcast to see if we could come to understand each other. And the most revealing moment of that podcast was when I said, let's talk about the J6 pardons. What do you think of the pardons? And he said, well, at least the president didn't pardon the people who committed acts of violence. I said, Ben, what the frick are you talking about? He pardoned everybody. No. He didn't pardon people who committed acts of violence. Only the nonviolent people were pardoned. I said, don't you see? What you're saying is just not true, Ben. It's just not true. I'm not saying I don't live in my own bubble, but this is just objectively not true. We can, we then verified it. But there was this kind of moment where he kind of realized something that I had increasingly come to see, that it's not that these people necessarily disagree, it's they don't know what we're talking about. And they don't know not because they are affirmatively ignorant or not because they're lying to themselves, it's because they just like to live in a world where they are fed what they want to hear. All of us want to be told we are right and the other side is the enemy. And so the market feeds us that. That's the corruption of culture layer. And I think that's the fundamental problem to solve. And if we don't find a way to blow up engagement-based media. It might blow up. There are people optimistic that new AI will blow it up because it won't make as much sense, blah, blah, blah. I don't know. Congress could blow it up. There's things that could happen if we had a functioning government. If we don't find a way to blow it up, or at least create another way to understand what we think that doesn't depend on it, then we're toast. So if you ask me, do I think we're going to win? Don't ask me that. But I know what I need to do. I know what I need to do every day, and that's what I'll do. Yeah.
That's a perfect segue to what I was going to ask. So a few countries like Australia are starting to try and get a handle on the social media through regulation on kids. I'm just curious if you see any possibility with that route or if that's fruitless.
Yes, I do. I think it's actually the weak link, and a huge percentage of the world population is living in countries that have now committed to banning social media for kids under 16. Something like 40% of the planet lives in those countries. Now, those are also countries where technology companies don't have huge political power. So that's why it can happen. And we live in a country where technology companies have huge political power. I saw this firsthand. I was Frances Haugen's lawyer when she came out as the Facebook whistleblower. So I spent an enormous amount of time reading the Facebook files. And the Facebook files are filled with stories of really decent engineers who identified real problems and had real solutions to those problems. You know, discovering that the platform was leading young girls to high rates of suicide that just had never been seen before. They had technical fixes that would steer the content away, all sorts of brilliant strategies. And every time they had an idea, they brought it to management, and Zuckerberg's simple question was, how did this affect engagement? And if engagement went down, they wouldn't do it. If it didn't affect engagement, they would do it. Even if it was the lives of young girls, didn't matter. The question was engagement. Why? They have one job, maximize shareholder value, and that's what they were doing. So when she told her story to Congress, there's this magical moment when Republicans and Democrats alike were unified around the idea we need to do something about this. This is outrageous. We have to do something about it. It took about a week for the money to bend the Democrats first. AOC came out against regulating in this way because it wasn't fair to regulate if we didn't have general privacy policy doing everything. And when I saw that, I realized, you know, we are just stuck in this corrupted system, and we can't imagine in the short term, without something like a revolution, that change happening here. It's going to happen elsewhere. And at a certain point, I think we're going to get enough sense in Americans to say, what's happening to our kids is devastating to them, devastating to them. And if we can't protect our kids, then who are we? So I'm hopeful, and we have to fight for this too, but we need to recognize what we're fighting against. And we're fighting against this corruption that Aaron told me to fight against 20 years ago, December. Yeah.
Hey, thank you for joining us, Professor Lessig. I just didn't want to let you off the hook on number 4 about constitutional corruption. And as a constitutional law professor, what is your best thinking about means to make the Constitution more democratic?
Yeah, you know, one way to look at the reason why we see the pattern of behavior in Congress, you know, I have a hammer, everything's a nail to me, so is the money problem. You know, so if you have spent 20 years of your life, as these Congress people have, sucking up to people with power to get money to fund your campaigns, we are selecting for sycophants. We're selecting for people who know how to yield to power. And so is it surprising that they don't stand up to someone with power? I mean, is that like abnormal for them? I mean, when have they ever stood up to someone with power? Right? They've learned how to get from people with power what they want, not stand up to them. And those brave Republicans who have, Liz Cheney was my student. I have enormous respect, even though I disagree with everything she believes. I have enormous respect for what she did. Thomas Massey, enormous respect for what he did. But all of them know exactly what happens when you stand up to the president. You get crushed. So even though the president was advancing policies that I think no more than 15 Republicans in Congress liked, they don't like the tariffs, they don't like the war in Iran, they don't like the idea of threatening Canada or Greenland, they don't like the corruption, they don't like any of it. Even though they don't like any of it, they can't muster enough votes to stop any of it. That's a product of cowardice. It's just cowardice. And somehow they think the cowardice is justified, as if a soldier saying, I'm not going to march the hill, I'm not going to charge the hill because I might get shot, is somehow a justification for not charging the hill. Like, that's your freaking job. It's your job to stand up to these threats and lose, get thrown out. Fine, at least you can go home and look at your kids in the eyes and tell them that you did the right thing. But it's astonishing they don't. And my point about the extortion part is to recognize it's not just them. You know, I think in 2024, if you said to me, would the billionaires cave? Would the universities cave? Would the CBS 60 Minutes cave? I would have said none of them would cave. None of them. Why would the billionaires cave? They have all the money in the world. What do they need more money for? All of them caved. All of them gave in. The universities, my university stood up and said, hell no, but by accident, because the Trump administration sent a demand that was so extreme, there was no way we could accept it. So the university said, no, we're not going to do it. And then the Trump administration said, you're not behaving because you shouldn't have taken us seriously. We couldn't have meant what we said in our letter. So, but the university discovered, once they had said no, the whole world said, oh my gosh, that's wonderful, and rallied to support the university. And, I think they're in an uncomfortable position because I think they would cave too. I think everybody caves because we all have been trained. This is what you do. It's what reasonable people do. What would it sound like if a Churchill said, we will never surrender? What does that even mean in our society? Because we all surrender. We're all surrendering. So somehow we need to revive that ideal. Right versus wrong. I will fight and lose. It doesn't matter if I lose. I'm going to fight for what's right. And the idea that our, quote, leaders can't do that is the biggest indictment, but it's not just them.
Is that working? Ooh. No, I got the power. I think I'm the last question. I live in the weeds of policy and community engagement, and I'm so curious about the community action groups or the list that you had on the screen, and Shariv, Mark's Plan for Revolution, which I'm right there with your brother. I'm super curious about whether those committees were invited by governments or whether communities demanded to be included in their governments.
Both. Increasingly, you're seeing, especially mayors. Mayors are the only real politicians who do things, right? They actually get stuff done. They have real problems they got to solve. They work to solve them. And they're increasingly discovering that the ordinary political process locally has been captured like every other political process. And so, you have like a town meeting and like certain voices show up, they've been organized to show up, they scream and yell, and no hard decisions can't be made. And then the people who are pushing this, and there are a lot of fantastic people who are pushing this, there's a group called FIDE, F-I-D-E, which is responsible for those. There's a wonderful group, Claudia Chawalas, who's out of Europe, who does, I will actually just make this stuff available so I can give you a list of resources here that are building these movements. There's a fantastic book by a woman named Helene Landemore called Politics Without Politicians, telling the story of her involvement in these citizen assemblies. My favorite book before hers is now my favorite, was a book called Against Elections by a guy named David van Reybrouck. Anyway, they're describing a process where politicians begin to recognize that they can actually use the people to solve problems that otherwise won't be solved. And so I think it's Boulder City in Colorado did a process for a huge land project where they couldn't make a decision of what to do with the land, and they pulled together a citizen assembly that made a study and a recommendation, and out of that process solved a problem that otherwise wouldn't be solved. And she, the mayor, has become a huge advocate for this process. So I think that as people begin to see its value and start rolling it into government everywhere, you will see recognition in people generally that this might actually be a more sensible way to solve many of our problems. Now, there are people out there who think, let's just get rid of Congress and to have random representative members selected. And I would be happy with that, but I'm not fighting for that. I think that's like just a little bit over the horizon right now. I think we just got to get to the place where we see these assemblies working as guardrails on what government does, like pushing them in a certain direction, solving problems we know they can't solve, in ways that demonstrate sense. But I'll give you one last recommendation. It's not yet out, but there's a film called Goodbye Politicians, Hello Democracy. So it's this fantastic young activist, a guy named Adam Cronkite, who wanted to do a national citizen assembly, but COVID happened. So instead, he did a citizen assembly in Michigan, virtual. And so they had this elaborate process to get a representative sample, relatively small, it was like 50 people, but they did it over Zoom, but they had beautiful cameras, so it was like really beautiful Zoom sessions. And I watched this movie, I'm a democracy geek, but I wept 4 times in this movie. Just couldn't believe it. There was, there's one scene where this, right-wing veteran from northern Michigan, white guy, starts by saying, this is all a hoax. There's no problem with COVID. This is all made up by the government. They're just trying to force us to do blah, blah, blah. And it cuts to this African-American from Detroit, and he says, yeah, well, I lost my mother. My brother's child is dead. My best friend has lost her sister and brother. And he goes through like 8 people who've died. And then you see the white guy, and the white guy just can't believe it. He just can't understand. Like, this is like not his world. He's just had no understanding of this. And over the course of the movie, you see these people, wildly different. Michigan is about as diverse as any state in the nation. Wildly different people come to a common consensus on what should be done. And they had a series of proposals that 70% of them, that were supported by 70% each of them. They had a high bar. They would only recommend things that 70% agree on. Really great ideas, which the state of Michigan ignored. But the point is, you can see it happen. You can see the magic. And I think the more of that happens, the more we will be convinced this is a way out. And we got to march quickly to get to it, because the problem with this is it's another 20-year project. I don't have another 20-year project in me, right? But I know this is where we have to go.
Okay, last question. Hi. The speaker last week focused a lot on international bodies that were enforcing or otherwise getting involved in various issues in the criminal court in The Hague and all that. And I'm real curious, you focus on the national level and the local level. Are there any international efforts or governments or bodies that have a lot of these ideas or have banded together to say, like, we want this too, and this is how we're going to move in that direction?
Yeah, so Europe is doing a bunch of them, which is the only logical international unit to be able to do them. But they run them regularly, and the EU is now trying to make this a regular part of decision-making. And even places, but that's the only international example I think we have. There was a really amazing project called the Global Climate Assembly, where they, again during COVID, they were able to construct a random representative group of 100 citizens of the world. And they did this through NASA data to figure out population locations. And they sent teams out into these remote parts of the world, because they had to be everywhere, to recruit people to be part of this conversation. And they really heavily supported, had translators, they gave them equipment to be part of this conversation. And they too produced an extraordinarily comprehensive and informed set of recommendations in this context. So it's happening everywhere. Not enough, not quickly enough, but it's happening, and I just think we have to find a way to make it our expression of what democracy is. And think about it, it's in some sense deeply American. We talk about who the sovereign in America is. So the states say they're sovereign, the federal government says they're sovereign, but we also say we the people are sovereign. If you look at the Constitution, the only sovereign that's expressly protected is the people, and it's protected through the jury. So you can't be prosecuted by the federal government unless a grand jury gives you up. So unless we give you up, you can't be prosecuted. And you can't be convicted of a federal crime unless we give you up, unless a petit jury, a small jury, gives you up. So the point is, we constitutionalized the idea that a random group of us could make critically important governmental decisions that would affect the lives of others of us. And just think about the jury. You know, a jury sits down and decides $50 billion has to be taken from Exxon because of an oil spill. Or, unfortunately, it decides whether a certain defendant is executed or not. They make the most serious decisions imaginable. And it's an incredibly imperfect system. Incredibly imperfect. And what I think I'm describing is, let's take that imperfect system, that imperfect idea, and perfect it. Make it really representative, not controlled by lawyers, not messed up by the way the system has learned to mess it up. And then, but tap into the same wisdom, which it just turns out we have. We have the capacity, if set up in the right context, to be the best versions of ourselves. And that turns out to be way better than what appears on Twitter. It's Twitter, or any of the other of these platforms. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you to Professor Lessig. And come next week for another talk at 7 p.m., same time, same place, to talk about disaster response, which is important and relevant as we have fires locally and everything else. So come back next week. Also, take a program on your way out, and the last page has a QR code where you can donate to help keep these things, these events free to the public. And thank you to Professor Lessig again.